everyone, and welcome to McAfee Answers. I'm Stephanie Olkers, and today we'll be answering what is the dark web and what are the dangers of the dark web and how can I better protect myself? If you have a question during the webcast, just click the Ask the Answer button in the bottom right of the screen and submit it there. Here to explain the dark web to us is Senior Vice President and CTO of McAfee, Steve Grobman. Steve, thanks for being here today. We'll turn the time over to you.
Okay, thanks so much for having me, Stephanie. This is an important topic because having people understand what the dark web actually is important for all of us to be aware of how to have the best digital cyber hygiene as we live our digital lives. So why don't we jump right into it? And to understand the dark web, it's important to understand that the dark web is part of the overall web, or what we think of as the internet. And when we think of the internet, there are different facets of it. A lot of times we think of what we call the surface web. This is all of the public facing content that we all know and love. So when you go to your favorite news sites or get information about products, essentially any of the uncontrolled public information that's just out there. But we also use the web as a conduit for more sensitive information. You can think of, when you use the web to access information about your medical records or your email, anywhere that it's information that only you have access to, things that you might have to pay for or use a password to log into. We term this the deep web because while it's using the internet as the conduit, it's not something that somebody could just search. It's like, even if I send my wife an email and say, honey, did you remember to buy dog food? If you search Steve Grobman dog food, you're not going to find that email, hopefully, in your Google search result. There's one other facet of the web that's really the topic of today's conversation, which is the dark web. And unlike the deep web that uses the exact same protocols and technology to access information, the dark web uses differences in the technology for access to make it such that there's a level of anonymity, both from the person that's accessing the information, but also from the entities that are hosting information. So it's a little different paradigm from both what we think of as that surface or deep web. So where did this thing actually come from? A lot of times we'll hear about the dark web in the news or read about it in a blog. But it actually came from the US government. Back in 2002, the US Naval Research Lab developed the initial technology for this, what we call the Tor browser, which is the first implementation of what we call onion routing, or the way that the dark web actually works in order to establish its anonymity. And what the US Naval Research Lab was trying to do was make sure that they had technology that when people were involved in sensitive operations in different parts of the world, that they could use the web without an adversarial environment see where they were surfing to. So if there was a US government employee that was in a country and they needed to access a website, if that country was something that was possibly an adversarial nation state monitoring traffic, if all of a sudden they saw that they went to, a set of websites that would indicate a high likelihood that they were a US government employee, that would be bad. So they built this technology, but they also recognized that they needed to make it available to the public, because if the only one using the dark web was the US government, it would still be obvious when it was a US government employee. So the dark web has a really interesting history, but there's a whole sequence of events that kind of led from that point forward, where when we have a technology that can be used for anonymity, it can also be used by both good and more nefarious purposes. So I'm not going to read every bullet on this chart, but some of the memorable things that have made headlines in the last couple of decades was some of the illegal use of the dark web. Back in 2011, Silk Road became this underground marketplace that would essentially sell anything on the dark web, really uncontrolled. And the challenge for law enforcement was because the technology made it such that both the people accessing the dark web as well as the providers of content were anonymous, it was very hard to track it down. And it took a couple of years. In 2013, the FBI finally shut down Silk Road, made a number of arrests, but clearly there's been lots of other illegal uses of the dark web, some of which we'll talk about over the next few minutes. But it should also be noted that at the end of the day, what the dark web is really about is privacy and guarding the privacy of both of the parties, which means there's all sorts of other benevolent uses of the dark web. For example, New York Times, Washington Post, they use the dark web so that if there's an anonymous reporter that wants to give a tip, they can do this with confidence. So we call this paradox of multiple uses really a dual use technology. In this case, you've got confidential tips or whistleblower sites taking full advantage of the dark web, but then you've also got illegal drugs, all sorts of what most of us would think of as illicit or nefarious activities. So when you think about the dark web as having these dual uses, one of the questions that might come to mind is, is this concept of a dual use technology something that's really unique to the dark web, or does it exist in other places? And the answer is dual use technologies are not new. They've existed for many, many years. Governments really struggle on how to manage things like export controls for dual use technology. For example, what this slide shows is a dual use technology that's a controlled technology by the US government. And what it actually is it's the machinery to build contact lenses. So the companies within the United States that build contact lens manufacturing equipment want to be able to sell that equipment all over the world, because enabling humans to have vision and sight is clearly a noble and good use. But it turns out the same technology that can operate with precision and tolerance to make contact lenses can also be used in missile development, other military applications. So in this case, what the government has done is they've set restrictions on this type of equipment so that it can be exported, but only under certain scenarios where they can track and validate that it's being used for contact lenses and not military applications. So coming back to our domain, the cyber domain, the question is what other dual use technologies are there? And there's a lot, and a lot of the controversy and debate that happens in the cybersecurity domain occur as they relate to dual use technologies. Things like encryption. So the algorithm that you see on the top left of this chart is the underlying algorithm that encrypts data using the RSA encryption algorithm. Encryption can be used to protect your data, but it's also the same technology that's used in ransomware to hold your data for hostage. If you think about things like Bitcoin, cryptocurrencies enable people around the world that don't have access to traditional financial institutions to use e-commerce. At the same time, because there's less regulation and inherently an easier ability to do things like money laundering, cryptocurrency has become the currency of choice for things like ransomware. So a cyber criminal demanding payment for you to get access to your data back is going to typically do that in a cryptocurrency because they can very easily convert that into a monetary instrument that is untraceable back to them. It also flows very easily across global boundaries. Other types of technology that McAfee is a strong advocate for is things like consumer VPNs. We have the strong belief that privacy is something that is the right of every consumer. And when you're using technology for something that you feel is of a sensitive nature, it's nobody else's business other than the parties that are required to understand what that is. So for example, if you're having a conversation with your doctor, we want to make sure that you have encryption technology to make sure that's not observable by somebody like your ISP that might be able to access the traffic, but also even like what websites you're going to. If you're researching a medical condition, it's nobody's business other than your own on what sites you're going to. That's what a consumer VPN does, is it makes it difficult for somebody that has access to the network flows to be able to triangulate or track, where a user is going. It probably drives many of you a little bit crazy when you have the situation you're looking for one product and then all of a sudden you start getting ads everywhere, and you might be asking yourself, how did they know that I was looking for a pop-up camper, and now all of a sudden I see ads everywhere for campers. So dual use technologies are just inherent in our domain. So the question is, okay, what should I really take away from this and what should I do? So first off, recognize the dark web exists. It's not inherently good or bad, but it is a powerful tool for a whole host of adversarial activities. So understanding when your sensitive information ends up on the dark web is something that everybody should have an awareness of. McAfee helps its customers with capabilities like our McAfee identity protection and dark web monitoring, so that if information like username or password for a site ends up on the dark web, you at least have a much higher probability of knowing that. We want to make sure that we empower users to safeguard private information. It's your decision who has access to sensitive information, not a network provider or the government that is ruling the country that you reside in. And therefore, we're a strong advocate and include in our products access to technologies like VPNs. These will make it appear that your connection is coming from somewhere other than your house, and it will make it much more difficult for somebody to associate that activity with you. So in the example I gave where you want to research a medical condition that you feel is important to keep to yourself and your family, a consumer VPN is very good at doing that. And finally, it's important that users practice good online hygiene. While it's important to know when information ends up on the dark web, once it's there, it's a little bit difficult to get it off. I sometimes use the expression, once the toothpaste is out of the tube, you can't put it back in. It's a little bit like that with your private information. Once your private information is stolen, you can't really prevent it from being out there, especially when technologies like the dark web exist. So having either a reputable password manager like McAfee's, or if you're going to do password management on your own, a different password for every critical site that has good complexity is really important, such that if one site gets compromised, it doesn't compromise you everywhere. So to wrap, I want to close with a answer to a question related to dual use technologies. I noted that this debate on whether certain technologies are good and bad is not new. And at the end of World War II, Orville Wright was asked the question in an interview whether he regretted inventing the airplane. And, you know, in World War II, the airplane was used for so much destruction and loss of life. And the way that Orville Wright answered the question was with the quote, "Fire has done enormous damage to human civilization over the centuries, but when you add everything up, it's still good that we had fire." Meaning that the way that we get in front of these technologies that can be used for good or bad is let's lean in and use them for as much good as possible so that we're overcoming the illicit or nefarious uses. So with that, I am going to open it up for questions. And I think, Stephanie, you're going to help moderate this.
Yeah, absolutely. So everyone, just as a reminder, you can ask your questions via the Q&A box. You can click submit in the right-hand side. We did have some questions, Steve, come in during your presentation. So first, the first question is, how do you access the dark web? Can anyone get to it? I think someone's asking for a user guide to the dark web. Do you want to provide that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So the dark web is open to anyone. The way that you would access it is you would download the Tor browser. So you can go to Wikipedia and read about the Tor browser. It'll have a link to the reputable site. You actually do want to make sure that if you're going to go onto the dark web, that number one, you actually get a valid browser like the real Tor browser, so you're not downloading a browser that has malware. But there's no cost. You know, it uses the same network protocols that you'll have access to. It should be noted that because the dark web does have these dual uses, some things might be flagged as what we call in the cybersecurity industry potentially unwanted, meaning that you might see some warnings from security software just kind of giving you a little bit of a warning, hey, like you're starting to go into a much less regulated portion of the internet, and just make sure you know what you're doing, because it's a little bit more of the Wild West. But absolutely, anybody can go on the dark web.
Yeah, so you kind of started going into here to the next question, and I think this came up because the dark web does have some urban mythic connotations. You know, you hear dark web and it's like, oh, the dark web. Is getting on the dark web in and of itself dangerous? You pointed out some risks, but can you kind of elaborate on that for us?
I'd say the dark web itself isn't inherently dangerous, but where you go on the dark web and what you do will start having you wander into increasing levels of danger. So, you know, if you want to use the dark web because you witnessed something egregious and you want to protect your identity, but utilize the Washington Post whistleblower or tip line, that's not going to be dangerous. Like if you go to the open web, find the dark web link for the Washington Post or New York Times, perfectly safe. If you go to a site that is offering quote unquote software on the dark web, be very concerned. Like that is very dangerous, right? Because generally you're not going to have the same level of retribution that you will on the normal web of knowing who was behind things you download or run. So you can use the dark web if you have a reason to. I would be a little more cautious of, just walking down dark alleys in the middle of the night with, money hanging out of your pocket, or the digital moral equivalent of that action, just for the fun of it. So, people should feel that if they understand what they're doing and use good digital street smarts, they can explore parts of the dark web, but also their level of caution should increase by a factor of 10 whenever they're doing anything on the dark web.
Great advice. So our next question, this was actually a question I kind of had too when we started delving into this topic and planning for this webinar. At McAfee, like you mentioned, we focus on privacy. And really, the dark web is about not being able to track and kind of blocking what you're looking at. And the question is about how do you balance this blocking with the needs of parents to monitor what sites their children are accessing and protecting children. So, I have teenagers. They're curious. So what recommendations do you have for parents to kind of balance that need for privacy with protection?
Yeah, it's a fabulous question because almost everything related to these technologies is a balance. Whether it's how do you balance everybody's privacy, whether it's a child or an adult, with the need to have the ability as a parent to monitor and mediate what content people go to. It's very similar to questions we get a lot of times from law enforcement, which is, how do we make sure that normal citizens living their lives have the ability to communicate privately, but if somebody is plotting a terrorist attack, that law enforcement has the greatest ability to see that information. Unfortunately, there's not a great answer. And I would say it this way. I think, as with a lot of other things, as long as a child is below a certain age, they really need to live by the rules and restrictions imparted by their parents. McAfee attempts to provide the technologies that allow parents to make those decisions based on what the right balance is for them. I also think that it's important to understand we shouldn't look at things, what we call in the tech space digitally or binary, where like you're either all in on privacy or all in on controls. That as a child gets closer to adulthood, figuring out ways to start allowing them to explore and have greater freedom, but still really understand that there are dangers and there are going to be limits that a parent may impose up until they reach the age of adulthood.
Thanks. I appreciate that answer. Like I said, I have teenagers, and any advice is welcome. So last question that we have right now, hopefully maybe some more will come in, but the last one we have is, are the trade-offs between the benefits and the risks of the dark web worth it?
I'd say it this way, and it's a little bit of a strange way of answering the question. It doesn't really matter. And the reason that I say it that way is we can ask the hypothetical question of, in an alternate universe where the dark web never came to be, would we be in a better place? And it's unclear, right? Are the advantages the dark web has created for enhanced privacy, do they outweigh the nefarious and illegal use of the dark web by bad actors? What I would say is the technology does exist, and because it's sitting on top of open technologies, it's not going anywhere. So while it's an intellectually interesting question to ask, are the benefits outweighing the risks? I think the more important question is, how do we make sure that we're taking advantage of the technology to maximize its use for privacy protection, and also understand how we can maximize defense, understanding that cyber criminals will use the dark web as part of their criminal enterprise. For example, one of the things we see in ransomware is a criminal might host their web server with instructions on how to pay a ransom or things of that nature on the dark web. But we're going to focus on the things we can control, which is how do we detect that ransomware from executing in the first place? How do we provide the right guidance to get our customers back into a known good state if they are a victim of ransomware? It's really focusing on the things we can do versus looking at the things that we don't really have the ability to do.
Great points. We can't worry about everything in the world, so we focus on what we can. So thank you so much, Steve, for joining us today. That's all we have time for. Great advice and great, it's always a pleasure having you and hearing from you. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. We hope you join us next time. Until then, stay safe.
Thanks, Stephanie, for having me.